Star Wars The Grey War, Chapter 11 by Nathan Brown.
11. Kinza stood completely still, staring down the large woman in front of her, waiting for her to make a move. 25 or 30 students, ranging in age from 3 to what looked like 60, stood in a circle around them. They chanted steadily in a language that Kinza didn't recognize, stomping their feet into the dirt floor, lending the warm room a tense, ominous feel. Kinza studied her supposed opponent. The human woman looked to be about 40. She was the same height as Kinza but outweighed her by at least 40 kilograms. Her brown, thinning hair hung down to her shoulders, slightly obscuring her clammy face. She was dressed in a ratty, brown robe, similar to the traditional Jedi robe. This woman, this cult leader, carried only the faintest whisper of the Force, and Kinza could see she knew it. Fear was etched on her pudgy, pale face. She clearly didn't relish the idea of facing a fully trained Jedi. Kinza understood this woman's predicament. She didn't want to die, but at the same time, if she simply surrendered, she would become weak in the eyes of this cult that had built her into a god. Kinza harbored no qualms about slaying this woman, the leader of the Dark World as she called it. She had swayed the minds of these innocent Force users and, in Kinza's opinion, she should be punished for it. However, she was a Jedi, and she had to give this woman a chance. Moving slowly, she moved her hand from where it hovered over her lightsaber hilt and up, and her hands in a sign of peace. She took slow, measured steps toward the cult leader. "If you surrender now, you will be a prisoner of the Jedi," she yelled, trying to be heard over the stomping and chanting. It was obvious her words were having no effect on the determined, if fearful woman. She turned from her and looked into the eyes of followers around her. "You will be granted a fair trial. Any of your followers who surrender will be disarmed, separated and be set free under surveillance until such time as they are deemed no longer a threat." As she spoke, she felt something building behind her. She stopped addressing the crowd and turned once more to look at the woman. Her face had transitioned from a mask of fear and worry to anger and rage. Kinza had tried to steal her loyal subjects out from under her. Kinza knew what would happen next. The woman charged at her, pulling two short vibro swords from her back. Clearly this tiny cult didn't even have the means to obtain a lightsaber. As she closed the distance between them, Kinza simply lifted one hand and released a wave of force. As the energy moved forward, it picked up dirt along the hard-packed floor, letting the invisible path of the Force be seen. It reached the charging woman and shredded through her paper-thin force shield. She managed a quick grunt and shot backwards, punching a large hole in the dirt wall behind her. Kinza knew without checking that the woman was dead. She had almost certainly been pulverized from the force push, never mind smashing through the wall. Kinza looked around at the circle of cult members. They had stopped their chanting and now stood in stunned silence. The stillness was broken when one man, a middle-aged human, roared in outrage and charged. Spurred on by his action, the rest of the cult followed after him, most brandishing crude Durasteel or iridium weapons, some coming at her with only their bare hands. Kinza let out an exasperated sigh and grabbed for the weapon on her belt. Not her lightsaber but a stun baton. It was a non-lethal Merson 51Z stun baton, standard issue for all Jedi Sentinels. She ducked under the man's painfully slow stab and tapped him in the leg. He seized up and dropped to the floor. The crowd of people, varying in age, size, sex, and species, continued charging in on all sides. Kinza moved quickly, understanding now why she had to advance her skills before becoming a shadow. She said a silent thank you to Master Ratter as she instinctively ducked under a blade that she hadn't even seen. Luckily for her, the small size of the room and the lack of organization of their attack meant there were only ever a couple of cultists attacking her at once, the rest pushing from behind, trying to get at Kinza through the massive bodies. After only a few seconds, 6 people lay unconscious on the floor, being trampled by people eager to take their place. Kinza knew she had to find a way to stop the battle. In their rush charge, these people were harming themselves. Reckless, uncontrolled swings were hitting fellow combatants and unconscious comrades. There were already 5 severely injured, if not dead, beings that Kinza could see. Kinza knew she had to do something. She used the baton to slap away a knife that had almost slipped through her defenses while she was lost in thought. Yet another reason she needed to end this fight. She could feel herself getting tired and knew she couldn't keep this up for much longer. He gathered up a small amount of force and launched herself over the remaining horde towards the hole the body of the cult leader had created. She landed by the hole and dashed out of the makeshift dirt temple. The dirt building was located in the middle of a chilly tundra, surrounded for kilometers by reddish dirt, the occasional dwarf tree and tiny, malnourished shrubs. Cold winds swirled around her and quickly froze the thin layer of sweat that had formed from fighting in the warm, cramped space. As she waited for the untrained army to come after her, she gathered up her force. After a couple of seconds, the first of them slowly left the temple. Of the 18 or so cult members that were left alive and conscious, only 14 exited the temple to pursue her. The group surrounded her in a semicircle, all of them nervous to be the first to jump into a fight with her. Before any of them could build up the courage, Kinza released the force energy she had been building. Ever since she had been up at the one under Master Rilf, and the young knight fighting the mercenaries and soldiers of the Sith, she had been interested in force stun. To be able to defeat an enemy without harming them seemed to her to be the perfect tactic of a Jedi warrior. She had been training in the ability for most of her life, especially in the last year and a half. She focused in on every person before her, every angry and nervous face, and released her pent-up power. As soon as she released the force within her, she collapsed to the ground. It felt as if the force she had released had pulled her strength and energy out with it when it left her body. She lay there, with her face pressed against the cool dirt, for a few seconds before she could catch her breath and drag herself to her feet. As her blood circulated, bringing life back to her tired muscles, she looked at the people frozen all around her, somewhat amazed and impressed at her own abilities. She left them behind and walked into the tiny dirt temple. She knew from experience they would remain frozen for 10 minutes at the least. As she entered the temple, he saw an old Sarian man. The wisps of hair atop his cone-shaped head had long ago turned white. He surrounded by 2 young boys and a girl. The oldest looked to be about 8 and the youngest could be no more than 3. The old man slowly started to bend to his knee, his shaking body and twisted face showing how painful it was for him. Kinza reached out and pulled the man up before he could get to his knee. The elderly man nodded his thanks. "I don't ask anything for myself," he began in a slow, raspy voice. But these children didn't truly understand what was happening. "These 2, he said, gesturing to the youngest boy and girl, "they were born into this, and none of them had a choice to leave. I beg you to let them go free, or perhaps make them into Jedi like yourself," the man said, his voice croaking painfully. Despite her exhaustion, Kinza couldn't keep from smiling. She had just single-handedly defeated almost 30 dark side followers and had rescued these force-sensitive children whose only crime was being born in the wrong place or being found by the wrong people. It felt good to be a Jedi. Today seen change. Naman had been traveling along the strange path for hours without another incident with the wildlife. He had been keeping track of his distance and, by now, alternating between a brisk walk and a slight jog, he guessed he was just a kilometer away from his destination. He had seen the clearing in the distance when he had taken his ship down and he thought he would have hit it by now. Around every bend he expected to come to the large clearing around the temple, but the thick, black forest showed no signs of thinning. After another 5 minutes of jogging, the forest suddenly ended without warning. He stood in the clearing he had been searching for. only a few meters away from a surprisingly high, durasteel wall. It okayed strange, the dark blue light reflecting imperfectly off the shiny, metal surface of the massive wall. The thick trees had blocked it out and now he was shocked at the size of it. The wall extended to the left and right of him at least half a kilometer in each direction. It extended up at least 10 meters above Namon's head. It was unfair to call this place a temple, it was a fortress. As soon as he stepped into the small clearing towards the fortress, his mind was assaulted, his head pounded, and he had to fight to stay on his feet. The force was so present here it felt oppressive. It seemed to be attacking him. He staggered forward and tried to control himself as his mind slowly adjusted to the massive amounts of force energy bombarding it. Before he could fully regain control of his faculties, a section of the metal wall slid open and a group of about 20 humans filed out of the fortress. They all wore long, bright red robes that cast a stark contrast against the blue black surrounding. They stood still and silent as if waiting for him to recover fully, instead of taking advantage of his obvious weakness. Building up barriers around his mind, he protected himself from the darkness around him trying to get in and tear it apart. He stood up straight and waited with his hand on the hilt of his lightsaber, wanting them to make the first move. He grew puzzled when, instead of drawing weapons, they began a strange chant. Namon recognized their speech as the ancient language of the Sith species. After a few seconds Namon picked up on what they were saying. Live to protect, die to defend. The men and women chanted these simple words over and over. Namon became apprehensive as the chant grew louder and he felt the force being drained from the ground and the air around him into the group of robed humans. It felt like an unnatural nexus of dark force that was being held above the group. Suddenly the chanting stopped and they shot their hands out towards Namon. 20 thin tendrils of red electricity came out and advanced towards him. Before reaching him they arced inwards to form one thick bolt of flaming lightning. After the trees and the Yaren, he was no longer surprised by the inhabitants of this planet. He reached out and used the force to redirect the current. He brought it into his hands and then split it apart, so the one stream became multiple thin tributaries. He used the force to control the arcs, letting them flow all around him but containing them so they wouldn't fly out of his reach. He couldn't see past the blinding whirlwind of crackling red light, but he assumed the robed defenders wouldn't risk attacking him while he was surrounded by the deadly electricity. He conjured a force shield, millimeters from his skin, to protect himself. As the storm flew around him he added his own lightning to it, his blue mixing with the human's red, letting the tempest grow in speed and size. He held back some of his fire, letting it build within him as the rushing tornado of electricity built on the outside. Gritting his teeth, he held onto it for what seemed like ages, until the air around him and the flames inside him burned too hot for him to stand. He shot his force forward, a broad wave of dark side power carrying the colorful, crackling energy. It rolled over the group, the kinetic energy pushing them backwards and the lightning passing through and killing the entire group. Namon walked confidently through the field of bodies, their robes covered with large, black burns, their bodies broken and twisted. He used the force in the atmosphere around him to replenish the strength he had lost creating the force storm. He walked up to the shining durasteel wall through which the dead cultists had exited. The section of the wall that had opened was now firmly back in place. He considered jumping over the high wall or trying to find another opening but chose a more direct approach. He ignited his lightsaber and shoved it through the wall, the hot blade easily melting the metal. With ease he traced a large hole in the wall and kicked it in, the massive slab of durasteel falling inward with a metallic groan. He had been afraid it would be hard for him to navigate the fortress as he had never seen any blueprints of it, but as soon as he stepped through the hole he'd created, he saw that wouldn't be a problem. From the outside it had looked like a miniature metal castle, but now Namon saw the truth. It truly was just a large protective wall. There was nothing inside the four walls, nothing but a small, old, run-down wooden house that looked like it should have collapsed to dust a long time ago. Naaman hadn't been able to find any information on the ancient Sith Lord's early life, but he assumed this had been the house that Darth Simus had grown up in. The cultists must have built these walls around the birthplace of the man they worshipped. Expecting the Force to grow even stronger in this small house, Naaman built up his mind's Force defenses, preparing for another invasive attack. Naaman entered the house, bending his neck in order to fit under the low door frame. Surprisingly, instead of the Force growing stronger as he squeezed into the tiny house, it seemed that the air was completely devoid of the Force. As he stood there, puzzled once again at the strange planet, he felt his own Force being pulled away. It felt similar to when his master used her confusing powers to dampen his ability to see or connect with the Force, but it wasn't exactly the same. Instead of just being dampened, his Force was being stolen from him. The bare interior of the humble home matched the degrading exterior well. There was a small kitchen with a floor of packed, wet dirt, hardly bigger than the cockpit of a one-man starfighter. The only other room was equally small. Naaman assumed it had been a bedroom, though there either never was a bed or else it had been removed. The bare, run-down interior along with the lack of Force and the dark rays filtering through the glassless window gave the house a decidedly creepy feel. The only non-ancient looking thing in the house was a small, meter-high pedestal that looked to be made of ivory. Atop the pedestal was something large covered over by a piece of thick black cloth. He reached down and grabbed the corner of the covering, pulling it off slowly and revealing the beautiful artifact beneath. His breath was stolen from him when he saw the treasure he had been sent for. It was a large broadsword sheathed in its scabbard. It had a surprisingly long, black hilt and a blood-red pommel that was into the Sith symbol. It had a relatively small but sturdy crossguard. They were each about 5 centimeters long and slanted down, away from the pommel towards the blade. Without hesitation, he reached for the plain but beautiful hilt. As his fingers brushed against the pommel, he felt a small jolt and felt the sword reaching inside of him, as if searching for darkness within Naaman to gorge itself on. At the same time, the Force within him grew. Naaman felt it responding to this intrusion, and the fires within him expanded. He gripped the hilt fully and pulled the sword from its black scabbard. It had a wide, diamond-shaped blade, colored a mute dark gray, and still razor-sharp after who knows how many years. The blade was long, though not as long as the hilt would suggest, and had a more gradual taper than most swords he'd used in the past, ending in an only slightly sharp point. It was clearly meant for hacking and slashing rather than stabbing. He was amazed at the weight of the blade. It seemed significantly heavier than it should be based on its size. Naaman assumed it was made of some ancient, extremely heavy metal. He used both hands to heft it and was once again confused at the length of the hilt. Even using both hands to hold it, there was room for another hand on the hilt, and he had massive hands compared to most other species. He also found the sword wasn't properly balanced. The center of gravity or point of balance on the blade was about 16 centimeters away from the hilt, while on a normal sword of this size it would be maybe 6 to 8 centimeters away. He bent low again and left the tiny house so he would have room to properly test the sword. He swung it around, going through a few basic sequences with it. The blade felt strange. It took him a while to get used to the strange balance. He tried holding it closer to the pommel of the hilt rather than the crossguard. It was clear after only a few moves that this was the way the sword was supposed to be held. He quickly found that it worked best with broad slashes rather than quick stabs. He swung it around, moving fluidly and letting the momentum build, the speed and the strength increasing with each slice. The strange point of balance in the long hilt made more sense to him now. It seemed to be built to utilize momentum. He went back into the hut and grabbed the scabbard. It was black with red scrawling letters. the color perfectly matching the pommel. He studied the letters. They were written, as he expected, in the language of the ancient Sith. One of the first things Darth Cognus had made him learn was how to read, write and speak ancient Sith, so he had no trouble with these words. Force-eater, consumer of souls. The blackest end. It seemed this sword had a few names to choose from. He returned the blade to its scuba, rode and began his long jog back to the ship, a noticeable spring in his step. Scene change. But they're just children. Kinza pleaded, raising her voice to the tiny blue image. She took a breath, reminding herself to remain in control of her emotions. How can you blame them for what they were involved in? She asked, keeping her voice calm. We're not blaming or punishing them for the actions of the cult. But you must understand, they are simply too old and too damaged to be trained. They were born into the dark side, and to try to train them now would be too much of a risk. I'm sorry, Kinza, but they cannot become Jedi, Master Liftling told her, speaking in her slow, infuriatingly condescending voice. How can they be too old? The oldest is only 7 and the other 2 are still toddlers. There are plenty of younglings who are older than that. I was older than that. She refused to give up on this. Yes, and look at the result, Master Liftling said after a pause, her voice cold and precise. The words struck Kinza like a slap in the face. She wanted to scream, to yell at the self-righteous master. Who was she to be judging Kinza? Kinza had just diffused a cult of almost 30 Darksiders, while all Master Liftling did was sit in the council room collecting dust. She wanted to rant, to show the woman her hypocrisy. Instead, she angrily stabbed at her HOLO communicator, cutting off transmission from Master Liftling. She knew if she exploded, if she showed her anger to Master Liftling, she would just be proving a woman's point for her. Scene change. Naman walked briskly down the stairs to the training room, led by the sounds of swooshing lightsabers and the grunts of combat. He entered the large room to see his master in a furious battle against opponents he couldn't see. He stood in awe as she moved, jumping and dodging with amazing speed and grace, a long and patient dance before striking suddenly with blinding speed and strength. As she moved, he began to visualize her opponents. She flipped over one and he saw her slice a line into its back. After another minute of watching her battle, he noticed that her eyes were closed. She must be using the Force to cast illusions of these enemies only she could see. Nama knew from experience that Darth Cognus often created a copy of herself or another being that couldn't move in order to distract her opponent, but he hadn't known she could accomplish something this elaborate or long-lasting. It's as something for him to keep in mind. Another thing for him to file away was the fact that she seemed unaware of his presence. With her eyes closed and her force focused on creating and defeating these enemies, she could not see or detect him, certainly a fact to remember. Scene change. Darth Cognus chuckled to herself at the hopeful naivete of her apprentice. As an Itochi, she had a natural ability to peer into people's minds. This natural ability was extremely enhanced by her mastery of the F-org. She was now able to read the basic thoughts of most beings, and her young apprentice was no exception. She could tell he thought that she didn't know he was there, and he saw this as a weakness he could exploit. If he ever attempted to capitalize on this weakness, he would be sorely disappointed. Scene change. After a few minutes, Naman sent out a wave of dark energy, not strong enough to physically affect his master, but just to let her know he was there. Darth Cognus stopped mid-flip and fell to the ground, landing silently into a crouch. Standing slowly, she extinguished her sabers and opened her eyes. Naman held out his sword and bent to one knee before his master. I found the artifact I was sent for, he said to her, straining to keep the elation out of his voice. Cognus grabbed the hilt of the sword and pulled it out of the sheath. Humph! heavier than I would have expected. She grabbed it with both hands and swung the sword around clumsily, clearly not used to such a large, heavy weapon. Certainly not a weapon for me, she said with a smirk. But what about yourself? She asked, holding the blade flat and extending the hilt out to him. Even though he figured he was supposed to use the sword, he had tried to hold back his excitement, just in case. Now that he knew it was for sure, he couldn't help but smiling. He took the sword back and held it up. I feel more comfortable with it than I do with the lightsaber I created. But wouldn't this sword just be eek if it came into contact with a lightsaber? He asked her, remembering how his old sword had reacted to the Jedi's lightsaber. Darth Cognus shook her head. Allow me to explain this weapon you have received. This sword was built thousands of years ago by its previous owner, Darth Simus. He was a proficient Sith alchemist and, when he created this blade, he mixed a complicated alloy with arcane magic, imbuing it with the ability to deflect blaster bolts and block lightsaber attacks. When you first held the sword, did you feel it trying to suck the force from you? Nama nodded, remembering how the room it inhabited had felt devoid of the force in comparison to the rest of the planet. That, she continued, is because weapons such as these are hungry. They demand to be fed with the dark side, with passion and rage. However, similar to the obelisk that inhabited Darth Bane, it gives back something as well. It feeds off your emotions, off your dark force, multiplies it and then returns it to you in a continual, amplifying circle until you and the blade become a nexus of the dark side, the storm within and around you waiting to be released. It also grants you greater perception. You may not have noticed it yet, but the sword has an ability to heighten your senses. This helps make up for its weight and reduced speed when compared to lightsabers. Another curious trait of the sword is its response to force lightning. It absorbs any lightning and stores it until the blade hits something solid, including the lightsaber. Then the blade discharges the electrical energy it had been holding. Always keep this in mind. If you have a force shield prepared and your enemy does not, it will give you the advantage. One word of warning to you, this blade calls out for the dark side and produces a call that is almost impossible to mask. If you are ever in a situation where you feel the need to hide your dark nature, this weapon will betray you. Without explanation, she suddenly turned and jogged up the stairs. After a couple silent moments of waiting, she returned with arms full of scrolls, books and manuscripts. Here is all the information I could find on Sith swords. I suggest you read them all thoroughly before attempting to use the sword. Naman grabbed all the information and retreated into his room, eager to learn all he could about his exotic, yet familiar, new weapon. Scene change. Darth Millennial walked around, looking down at his small brood of loyal Soldai RS. Its members were slowly shrinking. He only had about 50 members left, but they would be enough. He had stopped sacrificing his accolades to the Force, trusting in his numbers to protect him when the Force had clearly abandoned him. He wasn't sure if this was simply a test or if the Force had truly chosen someone else, but either way, he knew it wouldn't be solved by sacrificing apprentices. Scene change. They were sitting across from each other, both staring hard at their food. They sat on opposite sides of a long, smooth, granite table, white with speckles of black and gray. Naman and his master were eating slowly, in complete silence. This was their nighttime routine. After they had their second round of training, they ate their dinner. At times Darth Cognus used this time to dole out another lesson in the intricacies of the Force, or they made conversation, but so far this night they had sat in silence, broken only by their forks scraping against the plates. "Why did you lay Avenue?" Darth Cognus asked him suddenly, interrupting their quiet meal. "From what I know, Barabels are fiercely loyal and almost never leave Barab 1, so what caused you to leave your people and start fighting?" "It's a long story," Naaman responded, shoving food into his mouth and trying to brush off the question. Well, we've got plenty of time, Darth Cognus replied, giving him a small smile. She clearly wasn't going to drop the subject. Naaman sighed and dropped his fork, letting it rest on Hi's plate. He looked up to see his master staring intently, waiting for the story. There is a Barabel legend from over 3,000 years ago. A small group of Jedi warriors crashed into Barab-1 during the time of war between the three Barabel tribes. They resolved the agreement, thus stopping the war before it began. So now the Jedi and the Barabels have an agreement between them. Every new generation of offspring is looked over by a Jedi recruiter, and any Force sensitives are taken. In return, the Jedi continue to mediate between the three tribes. When my generation's time came, I was put in line to be examined with the rest of the people my age. I was 4. The Jedi, an older human I remember, with dark brown skin and a large white beard, forced the children of all the forest to come together so he could go over them all at once. He walked slowly down the line of hatchlings, his eyes closed and his hands stretched out. As he neared me, I felt a sort of sickly revolting oppression radiating from the older man. I didn't know what it meant at the time, but I knew it wasn't something I liked, so I ran. I still don't know how no one saw me leaving, or noticed that I was gone, but they didn't. By the time I came back, the tribes were separating and going back to their own caves. The Jedi had left along with a girl I had grown up with and another hatchlings from the Hoskar tribe. On the long way back I heard some of the adults worrying that there had been a few less recruits than usual. So I grew up with this secret, never telling a soul, not even my family. As I got older I found I could do things other people couldn't, and I kept that secret too. Without any training, I practiced in secret, doing things over and over, levitating or pushing small objects, knowing what's around me even with my eyes closed, surviving falls that would kill anyone else. The more I did it, the easier it became. Then one day, when I was 18, I was in the forest. I was supposed to be hunting, but I was levitating a small rock. One of my brothers walked by and saw me. I tried to convince him to keep it a secret, but he refused. He threatened to tell our fathers. I tried to stop him and things got heated. I knew if he told anyone I would either be sent to the Jedi or at the least kicked out of the tribe. The Barabels hold the Jedi in very high esteem, and for me to do something like this would be considered a terrible betrayal. We drew our swords and fought. I was never trying to hurt him. I just didn't want to be found out. I easily managed to disarm him and I had him pinned to the ground with my sword at his chest, unsure of what to do. The sounds of our swords clashing had carried across the forest and, before I could make a decision, one of my fathers, along with 2 other elder tribesmen, came crashing through the forest. My father saw what was happening and drew his sword to protect my younger brother. We battled and he managed to overtake me. He gave me his. He pulled down his shirt and showed his master his scar. As the blade cleaved through my scales and flesh, I fell into a rage. Blind and full of strength, I batted away his sword and drove my sword through his chest before I knew what I was doing. I froze with my sword stuck in his chest, anguish, regret and anger filling me immediately. The feelings within me exploded outward and knocked the remaining tribesmen back. They were all rendered unconscious. I knew what would happen if I was captured. It's seen as a great offense when a Barabel kills a member of their own tribe, and I'd killed my own father. So I took the body and ran. I slung him over my back and ran deeper into the forest, searching for a place to live. I found a small cave and I buried my father just beside the entrance. I stayed in that cave for almost a year before another Jedi recruiter came after me. She defeated me and offered to take me as her apprentice, the other option being sent to a prison planet. I accepted to become her apprentice, planning to find some way to escape. There was a shipment of slavers heading to Algaro to fight in the gladiator pits, so I snuck away from the Jedi and found my way onto the ship. And that's how I got off Barab 1, and that's how you found me. Naman finished his story and looked back down at his food. Darth Cognu simply nodded a couple of times and they went back to eating in silence.